Here's Broadway Maven co-host Mateo Chavez Lewis.
Stephen Sondheim has obviously written the music and lyrics to many, many, many masterpieces, and they're all very different. Um, and Sweeney Todd is kind of this very dark horror movie on stage, is the way that Sondheim has described it. Because it's so important in the way that this show is constructed, is what's called a motif. I've spoken kind of ad nauseum about the idea of motifs here at the Broadway Maven because they are so, so important when you're looking at the composition of a musical score. If you don't know, the definition of a motif is basically some element of a show or some element of a work of art that is that repeats. And it repeats in a way that is intentional and is meant to communicate something so that over the course of these many repetitions, this thing comes to represent something. It becomes a symbol. Things that can be a motif, we can have a lyric motif. You know, we can have words that repeat. And in Sweeney Todd, for example, Mrs. Lovett is often saying, wait. And then Sweeney Todd turns that around on her and says, wait, you told me to wait, and now he'll never come again. So we take this thing, it repeats, and then we turn it on its head. And that's kind of the way that Sondheim develops motifs. Another, and an arguably more important kind of motif is a musical motif. So when we're listening to a particular melody or a particular set of chords on the piano, those melodies and chords, when they come back to repeat, begin to take on meaning greater than just what is being played because of the context. So a motif that comes up a lot in Sweeney Todd is this. And we're going to hear Sondheim talk about that, that little piano chunk. But every time we see that piano chunk come back, it tells the audience, okay, it's time for narration. It's time for a reprise of Attend the Tale of Sweeney Todd, and they're going to talk about Sweeney Todd, and it's going to be an ensemble piece, and it's going to be narration. We're detached from the story, because consistently every time we hear that, that's what happens. And so we become, it's like Pavlov's dog, you know, we become trained to expect narration from this. So it's kind of a way of telling the audience, okay, you can relax for a bit. We're going to tell you a bit about the story, and what's happening isn't really happening in the story. It's removed from the story, and it's telling the audience all that without telling them to their face. It's telling them through a repetition of a motif, and training them to understand what that means. Another one is Sweeney's madness motif, which we're going to look at a little bit later, which every time Sweeney starts getting obsessed with an idea or is really focused on something or is driving himself crazy, we get this like very kind of complicated, odd that in the piano. Every time we hear that, it's a sign that Sweeney's getting obsessed, Sweeney's getting anxious, and it's gonna blow up in a moment. So it's because we see that, we hear that, and then we see Sweeney blow up, and then we hear that, and then we see Sweeney blow up, and eventually we start to come to appreciate that every time we hear this, we know exactly how Sweeney's feeling, and we know exactly what he's about to do, which is probably kill somebody, especially later in the show.
Join our free weekly Broadway appreciation classes at thebroadwaymaven.com.
So now let's watch this video where Sondheim talks about his use of motifs in the show.
The notion of using motifs is to pink the audience's memory, to remind them constantly that, that this theme represents that idea, that emotion, or that character. They're guideposts along the way. I think in a sustained piece, you have to do that. And I think the identification of motives, also the audience's familiarity with the themes themselves makes them feel in a way more comfortable, because, you know, new music is very difficult to take in. And most people feel most comfortable with a score if they can hear what are called reprises. Well, instead of using reprises in this show...
So a reprise is a repeat of a full song, basically, or most of a song. For example, if you think about, like, Funny Girl, we have Don't Rain on My Parade is a song that happens in Act 1, but then at the end of Act 2, she comes back and she sings a bit of Don't Rain on My Parade again, which is a reprise of Don't Rain on My Parade. And instead of being a through composed score where little themes are interwoven together, that's more what a motif is used for. A reprise is just, okay, here's a song, here is a repeat of the same song. And that's kind of how they're different. Motifs are interwoven much more densely, whereas reprises are just isolated repeats of one song.
What I've done is use reprises of motifs rather than reprises of whole songs.
Exactly.
Sometimes there are reprises of little fragments of songs. But by the time the second act rolls around, the audience is familiar with almost all the musical material. Now, there is some new musical material in the second act, but there's a great deal of reuse of the old material. In fact, I dare say there's almost nothing in the show that isn't reused at least once.
You can look at any part of Sweeney Todd, and you can find a reuse of that kind of motif. Like a random example is Poor Thing, the song that Mrs. Lovett sings, where she's telling Sweeney Todd what happened to his wife while he was away.
Please like and subscribe.
She goes, bum, 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 where is it? There were these two, you see, wanted her like mad. One of them a judge, one of them is Beadle. Ba 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 da ba da 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 da. That melody, that's what she sings when she's telling him what happened to his wife. And at the end of the song, she says, and then she poisoned herself. Poison from the apothecary. And Sweeney Todd is like, oh no, my wife is dead. And Sweeney Todd has a whole emotional moment. Then, at the end of the show, they find out that the wife had actually been alive the whole time, just kind of driven crazy. And Sweeney goes, you lied to me. And Mrs. Lovett goes, no, not lied at all. No, I never lied. Said she took the poison. She did never said that she died. Or something like that, which is the same melody. There were these two, you see, wanted her like mad. No, not lied at all. No, I never lied. So she's using the melody of what she actually told him to say, no. Technically, I told you she took the poison, and I technically never said that she died. So I didn't lie. And it shows how clever Mrs. Lovett is, and how manipulative she is. Greenfinch and Linnet Bird is another great example. Like, there's just so many examples of little melodies that you would think are kind of randomly chosen. This melody sounds nice, but then it's the same melody somewhere else. And the fact that it's the same melody is never a coincidence with Sondheim. It's always tells you something really, really interesting about the plot of the show. How Sweeney Todd's wife is supposedly dead throughout the whole show. And we find out at the end that she wasn't dead. She was just driven crazy. We actually meet Sweeney Todd's wife, spoiler alert, very early on in the show as this befuddled beggar woman who is just around the streets. And we don't understand as the audience right away that this is an important character. But it turns out it's actually Lucy. Just the years have changed her and she's lost her mind a little bit. And in the music, there are hints that plot twist is coming. For those of you who don't know, the Dies Irae is a very famous like old-timey musical piece. And those 8 notes are like the first 8 notes of it, and it's a really long piece. But those 8 notes have kind of come to represent death in the public conscious, and a lot of movie scores use that. A lot of people use that to talk about death, or to reference death in like movie scores in and that kind of thing. A famous example is in La Vie Boheme from Rent. Mark says, "Dearly beloved, we've gathered here to say our goodbyes to the death of Bohemia," and they sing Dies Irae. That's what they sing. So it's kind of used to represent death in a lot of places, and that motif, Sondheim based a lot of the music in Sweeney Todd off of that those combinations of notes, to show how death is such a big part of Sweeney Todd's psyche, and it's just everywhere. It's in the streets. It's such a big part of this world, and so he's based a lot of the score on those notes. For example, the song "My Friends," which we're about to look at. These are my friends. That's just the first 4 notes of the Dies Irae, but backwards. Ba-da-da-da is the first 4 notes of the Dies Irae. These are my friends is the first 4 notes of My Friends. So it's just using the Dies Irae as this underpinning for a lot of Sweeney's music. And Sondheim has talked about that, and that is true. Sideways finds the Dies Irae in places that I think are a bit of a stretch. Like, he says things like, "These are like 2 of the notes from the Dies Irae with other notes in between." I don't know. I think that at that point, anything can be considered part of the Dies Irae, because, somewhere over the rainbow, where oh, are the first 2 notes of the Dies Irae. So where oh is it, but then anywhere that there's a semitone, that's going to be part of the Dies Irae. I don't know. I think that's a stretch, but it is a fact that Sondheim has talked about how a lot of a lot of this score is built off the Dies Irae.
And here's my Stephen Sondheim playlist.